Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Counterterrorism, Law Enforcement, and Intelligence will come to order. Without objection, the subcommittee may recess at any point. The purpose of this hearing is to receive testimony from a non-governmental panel of expert witnesses to examine the threats posed by nation-state actors in Latin America, like China and Russia, to the United States Homeland Security. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. Good morning, and welcome to the Subcommittee on Counterterrorism, Law Enforcement, and Intelligence. Today we are holding an important hearing on the threats posed by nation-state actors like the People's Republic of China, the PRC, Russia, Iran, and Venezuela in Latin America to our Homeland Security. There is no doubt that we are facing a migration crisis caused by the administration's policy decisions. We are witnessing significant increases in encounters at the southwest border with individuals from countries of concern like the PRC and Russia. I am concerned that the chaos of the southwest border could be taken advantage of by anti-U.S. regimes, not just can, but has been. Meanwhile, the PRC and our foreign adversaries are expanding their spheres of influence in Latin America, right in our backyard. As they grow their diplomatic, economic, and military activities in the region, there are clear implications for U.S. Homeland Security. Recent data released by the United States Customs and Border Protection shows a steep increase in encounters with foreign nationals from the PRC, Russia, Cuba, and Venezuela, amongst others, at our southwest border. For example, in the first 7 months of fiscal year 2023, over 9,711 PRC nationals were encountered by U.S. Border Patrol along our southwest border, exponentially more than the previous 3 years. Let me restate that number, 9,711 PRC nationals. A similar trend involves encounters with Russian citizens. In 2021, CBP reported just 4,103 encounters of Russian citizens along our southwest border. However, that number jumped to 21,763 in fiscal year 2022, and it's over 33,000 for the first 7 months of fiscal year 2023. I've heard directly from sheriffs in my own district that they apprehended multiple individuals from the PRC who were deemed high-value targets and were taken into custody by the FBI. While aliens may have legitimate claims to asylum, the increased flow of nationals from adversarial countries is concerning as these individuals blend into the much larger wave of illegal aliens flooding across the southwest border, already topping 1.4 million illegal alien encounters through the first 7 months of this fiscal year, 23. Meanwhile, Border Patrol agents at the southwest border are completely overwhelmed. There have been 1.5 million known gotaways at the southwest border since the start of this administration. This creates a gap in our Homeland Security intelligence that malign nation states could exploit to send nefarious actors into the U.S. It's important that this subcommittee fully understand the ways that malign nation state actors could take advantage of the wide open southwest border. However, the problem is not just there. It stretches further than that. There is no doubt that we are facing an array of security challenges in the region and by extension to Homeland Security. In particular, the PRC has developed close economic and security ties with a number of Latin American countries, including Brazil and Venezuela. For example, the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China offered approximately $137 billion to the region in loans to a multitude of sectors, with Venezuela as the most prolific beneficiary of PRC loans at roughly $60 billion. However, the PRC's influence in the region goes beyond economic ties. It also includes military and security partnerships. For example, in approximately a 10-year period between 2009 and 2019, $615 million in weapons were sold to Venezuela by the PRC. The PRC's increased influences in the region bolsters the CCP's geopolitical goals, which also includes strengthening other authoritarian regimes, leading to significant challenges to U.S. influence in the region, as well as security risks to the United States homeland. Earlier this year, Melissa Dalton, the Pentagon's Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and Hemispheric Affairs, testified that the PRC and Russia now pose more dangerous challenges to the safety and security of the U.S. homeland. They are both and I quote here from Ms. Dalton, already using non-kinetic means against our defense industrial base and mobilization systems to subvert our ability to project power. This transcends the egregious example of when the PRC entered our sovereign airspace with a high-altitude balloon, which we know with certainty they intended to use to spy on sensitive U.S. military and critical infrastructure sites. And then, just this month, the Biden administration confirmed the existence of a PRC-run electronic espionage facility in Cuba, roughly 100 miles from the United States, that would allow the CCP intelligence services to collect signals intelligence throughout the southeastern United States. Less than 48 hours later, an anonymous Biden administration official confirmed to Politico that the CCP has actually been using a secret facility in Cuba to spy on the U.S. since at least 2019. My Republican colleagues and I are demanding answers on this latest nefarious action by the CCP from DHS Secretary Mayorkas and FBI Director Wray to ensure the Homeland Security response is robust and steadfast. And I would love to have all of this committee in a nonpartisan way join that effort to understand those nefarious actions. This activity once again displays the CCP's willingness to use every tactic and technique to undermine U.S. sovereignty and shows that authoritarian regimes in Latin America can and will assist the CCP in attacking U.S. homeland security. Additionally, Russia continues to demonstrate its intent and capability to conduct military and other strategic activities against the United States in the Western Hemisphere. Russia's influence in the region mainly comes from security ties on which it has colluded with anti-U.S. authoritarian regimes, including Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. For example, Russia has assisted Venezuela with sanctions evasion, using Russian state-controlled companies to transport Venezuelan oil. Russia also uses the Wagner Group, a private military company, to project power worldwide. The Wagner Group tries to undercut the United States and present itself as a mediator and security partner to anti-U.S. countries and gain military access rights and economic opportunities. For example, they are training Venezuela's armed forces. Additionally, Iran plays a secondary role in the region. The recent docking of Iranian warships in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, indicate Iran is looking to assert its power across the region. Iran's backed militia, Hezbollah, continues to have a presence in the region, with the transition from the tri-border area of Paraguay to operations in Venezuela. Whether it is the PRC, Russia, or Russia's proxies, or Iran, it is vital that we understand the security challenges and threats posed by nation-state actors to U.S. homeland security and explore every avenue to address them head-on. This morning, we have a distinguished panel of expert witnesses to discuss this important topic with. And I'd just like to say that, we're facing challenges all over the world. I personally think that this is one of the most challenging security environments that we have ever been in, including the World War II era. We know some of the threats and some of the threats we don't know. The nature and the face of these threats has changed. It's no longer just missiles in Cuba like we saw decades ago. The cyber threat is egregious. Economically, what these countries are doing to use their influence and to really hurt the people of countries, especially in our backyard in South America and Latin America. So I'm excited to hear from our witnesses. I'm excited to have this conversation today because I hope it informs the rest of Congress that we must keep our eye on the ball. We must understand what the Chinese Communist Party is doing and the malign activities that they will use to undermine not just our influence and our economic prowess around the world, but also our homeland security right here at home. I thank all the witnesses for being with us this morning, and I look forward to our discussion. I'd now like to recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Magaziner, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. We find ourselves in a time when, once again, democratic nations, like the United States, are in a competition for the hearts and minds in the developing world with autocratic competitors like the People's Republic of China, Iran, and Russia. It is more important than ever that we build strong relationships with our allies in Latin America based on mutual respect, fair commerce, and a shared commitment to security and human rights. If we make the mistake of driving away our allies in the region, Russia, the Chinese Communist Party, and our other competitors will gladly fill that void at the expense of our own security. In Latin America today, the CCP and Russia are attempting to manipulate public discourse, discredit elections and the electoral system, influence policy, and disrupt markets with the goal of undermining U.S. security and economic competitiveness. We cannot allow that to happen. Over the past 20 years, the CCP has spent heavily in Latin America. Chinese state industry now reaches deep into Latin America's energy, infrastructure, and space industries. In fact, China has surpassed the United States as South America's biggest trading partner. I will say it again, China has surpassed the United States as South America's biggest trading partner. China now has free trade agreements in place with Chile, Costa Rica, Ecuador, and Peru, and 20 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean participate in the CCP's Belt and Road Initiative. And the Chinese Communist Party is investing in soft power through cultural and educational programs in Latin America, which are building political goodwill and presenting China as a viable alternative partner to the United States and other democracies. This is why it is so important that last year President Biden launched a new economic cooperation initiative with Latin America aimed specifically at countering the CCP's growing clout in the region. Under Vladimir Putin, Russia cares less about competing with the United States economically and more about stoking chaos and political division to harm democracies like the United States. Russia has maintained decades-long relationships with Latin American authoritarian regimes. The Cuban, Venezuelan, and Nicaraguan regimes are heavily dependent on Moscow for political, economic, and security assistance, and Russia actively spreads propaganda in Latin America to undermine U.S. interests and the interests of democratic allies, just as Russia did in the early days of its invasion of Ukraine, when Russia used its propaganda assets in Latin America to push conspiracy theories about Ukraine and the West to justify the invasion. With the CCP, Russia, and other autocratic regimes so determined to build their presence in Latin America, it is vital that the United States strengthen our relationships with our neighbors in the region. The worst thing we could do for our own security is drive our Latin American neighbors into the arms of our adversaries. That is why it is disturbing to hear former President Trump and some of my colleagues from across the aisle, though of course not all, push reckless ideas like unilateral military action in Mexico, which would seriously endanger the strategic regional relationships we need to keep America secure. It is also alarming that some House Republicans are calling for significant cuts to USAID, State Department, and Commerce Department budgets that are crucial to building American influence in Latin America, at the same time that the CCP, in particular, continues to invest in aid and commerce to build their malign influence in the region. As we go through the appropriations process in the coming months, we need to keep in mind that investing in aid and commerce in Latin America is not charity. It is in our national security interest. So this is a time for engagement and partnership, not hyperpartisanship. And today's hearing, I hope, is an opportunity for this subcommittee to examine what we can do to counter the wider threat posed by autocratic nation states that are setting up shop in the Western Hemisphere with the goal of undermining U.S. leadership in our own backyard. I hope that we can work together to counter their efforts and advance American interests. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Magaziner. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. And I'm pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this very important topic. I ask that their witnesses please rise and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before the Committee on Homeland Security of the United States House of Representatives will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God. Thank you. Let the record reflect that the witnesses have answered in the affirmative. I'd now like to formally introduce our witnesses. Ms. Elaine Dazinski is the Senior Director and Head of the Center on Economic and Financial Power at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. With more than 2 decades of leadership in public, private, and international organizations, she is a globally recognized expert and thought leader on geopolitical risk, supply chain security, anti-corruption, and national security. She also held positions at the Department of Homeland Security under the Bush administration, including Deputy and Acting Assistant Secretary for Policy and Director of Cargo and Trade Policy. In 2015, Ms. Dazinski launched Lumerisk LCC, a risk advisory practice. And in 2017, she served as a senior fellow at the Jackson Institute for Global Affairs at Yale University and as a lecturer of business ethics in Yale's program on ethics, politics, and economics. In 2020 to 2021, she served on the newly formed Chairman's Council on China Competition at the Export-Import Bank of the United States. Thank you for being here. Mr. Christopher Hernandez Roy is the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow of the Americas Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Throughout his more than 25-year career, Mr. Hernandez Roy has worked extensively to advance democratic governance, prevent and resolve conflict, strengthen the rule of law, respect human rights, ensure citizen security, and promote integral development across Latin America and the Caribbean. He has held various senior leadership positions at the Organization of American States, or OAS, having served as senior political advisor to 2 secretaries general. In this capacity, he most recently documented the abuses of authoritarian regimes in Venezuela and Cuba and co-led the organization's efforts to hold the Venezuelan regime accountable for possible crimes against humanity. He also was intimately involved in the peaceful resolution of border disputes between Honduras and Nicaragua, Belize and Guatemala, and Honduras and El Salvador. Thank you for being here. Ms. Jessica Brandt is Policy Director for Artificial Intelligence and Emerging Technology Initiative at the Brookings Institution and a Fellow in the Foreign Policy Program's Strobe Talbot Center for Security, Strategy, and Technology. Her research interest and recent publications focus on foreign interference, digital authoritarianism, and the implications of emerging technologies for democracies. Ms. Brandt was previously head of policy and research for the Alliance for Securing Democracy and a senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States, a fellow in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, special advisor to the president of the Brookings Institution, and an International and Global Affairs Fellow at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at Harvard University. I thank all of the witnesses for being here. I know you have submitted incredible testimonies, and I'd ask at this time that you summarize those, and please try to keep to 5 minutes. We do have questions on those testimonies, and at this time I recognize Ms. Elaine Dazinski for your 5 minutes to summarize your opening statement.
Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziner, thank you so much. Distinguished members of the subcommittee, I appreciate the opportunity to be part of today's conversation. Latin America has become increasingly vulnerable to authoritarian encroachment. Instead of being filled with democratic friends and booming economies, America's backyard is home to Russian bombers and mercenaries, 29 Chinese-owned ports and port projects, a widespread Iran and Russia-fueled anti-US propaganda, Chinese-enabled fentanyl and money laundering operations, wobbling and fallen democracies, and widespread economic and political instability. In the aftermath of 9/11, DHS could count on and leverage the primacy of US global leadership and economic influence to address a range of foreign threats to the homeland. 2 decades later, our economic, trading, and monetary systems are being weaponized against us by foreign adversaries and competitors, and in the process, escalating the erosion of democratic rules and norms. These threats impact not only our physical borders, but our financial, digital, and trade borders. Since 2008, Latin America has seen a greater decline of democratic indicators than any other region globally. Authoritarian regimes are driving migration to the southern border in tremendous numbers, with migrants from Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua now outnumbering migrants from the northern triangle of Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. If we seek to address root causes of migration and broader threats to the national and economic security landscape, addressing rising authoritarianism is a strategic imperative, but it also means fighting back against a false narrative designed to undermine the US role in the region. The challenge of authoritarian influence in Latin America presents critical questions about how the US can use its economic and political power to drive stability, opportunity, investment, and democratic principles. DHS has a central role to play, but it requires an evolution of mindset and operational readiness. The department needs to further prioritize its assessment of economic security threats, drive more effective deployment of both physical and digital boots on the ground, invest in securing and critical infrastructure, improve border management tools, and have more access to critical data. Finally, it requires a long-term commitment to mutual security and economic benefit for the region, with more purposeful engagement with allies and partners. In my testimony, I outlined several concrete actions that DHS and the administration could undertake. One is to identify and analyze a broader range of economic security threats as core drivers of Homeland Security vulnerability. We need to continue to shift the intelligence and analysis framework to encompass a wider range of actors, threats, and data sources. Secondly, re-engaging and expanding private sector supply chain partnerships to improve information and data that supports better intelligence gathering and analysis. We need more and deeper partnerships with the private sector, especially those involved in manufacturing, transporting, importing, exporting, and investing in commercial operations throughout Latin America. Extension of mechanisms like the Authorized Economic Operator program offers potential pathways to work with more private sector actors and have more access to trade data. Third, conducting a detailed review of China's multi-layered influence on ports and trade infrastructure is critical. DHS could lead or co-lead a comprehensive review of vulnerabilities at Latin American ports, including links to sanctioned entities, Chinese-made technology, assessment of 5G networks, trade data information, China's operations and maintenance strategies at ports, and assessing the risk of dual-use infrastructure. Fourth, expanding the effectiveness of trade transparency units. Trade transparency units, or TTUs, were established in 2004 to exchange trade data between the U.S. and trading partners to better understand the risks of trade-based money laundering. We really need to get at this problem, and TTUs are a good way to do it. Increasing investigative work to uncover Chinese money laundering networks and financial institutions supporting them is absolutely critical. As my colleague Anthony Ruggiero and I have written, Congress should authorize the President to impose a range of sanctions on the facilitators who serve drug traffickers, including individuals who are grossly negligent concerning financial transactions or who export drug precursors. Supporting legislation to counter kleptocracy and state-sponsored corruption is also critical. Legislation such as the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act, which was introduced in the last Congress, could help with expanding anti-corruption enforcement tools and building on the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Finally, a broader strategy to ally shore with regional partners can bring the benefit of new supply chains, emerging technologies, and opportunities to drive higher levels of U.S. and Western investment. DHS can help create the security framework that facilitates deeper trade, economic engagement, all of which is essential to protecting the homeland. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Dazinski. The chair now recognizes Mr. Hernandez Roy for his opening statement of 5 minutes.
Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziner, and distinguished members of the Subcommittee on Counterterrorism, Law Enforcement and Intelligence. Thank you very much for allowing me to testify today on this important subject. The democratic, relatively prosperous, and largely pro-U.S. nature of Latin America and the Caribbean has been a strategic asset for the United States for decades. Yet the region today is at a tipping point. There is a significant risk that it could become a liability in strategic competition with China, to a lesser extent Russia, in the next decade. In particular, the influence of extra-regional authoritarians, to include also Iran, has been on the rise throughout Latin America. These actors pose an interlocking challenges to regional and, by extension, U.S. security. While each possesses different capabilities and long-term objectives, they often coordinate both informally and formally to challenge U.S. influence in the region. It is therefore important to view these three actors not in isolation, but how their behaviors reinforce and interrelate. Moscow, Beijing, and Tehran each espouse different geopolitical goals and worldviews, yet they have shown an alarming degree of convergence when it comes to efforts at fomenting discord and disruption within the United States' shared neighborhood. Such efforts come both through support for overt authoritarians, especially the dictatorial regimes of Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, but also where they cannot totally pull countries out of the U.S. orbit. These regimes seek to peel away once staunch U.S. allies and convert them into comparatively neutral bystanders. This can be seen with the rhetoric of the government of Brazil, ascribing blame to both Ukraine and Russia for the war, and in Argentina, Brazil, and long-standing ally Colombia's refusal to sell Soviet legacy weapons to help Ukraine defend itself. It is noteworthy that no Latin American country, save Costa Rica, has joined the international sanctions effort against Russia. Russia's brutal and illegal invasion of Ukraine has caused autocracies the world over to close ranks and sharpen their competition with the United States and with fellow democratic allies. From a Russian nuclear-capable strategic bomber visiting Caracas a few years ago, to more recent developments such as the docking of Iranian warships in Brazil, to possible Iranian drone manufacturing in Venezuela for use against Ukraine, to revelations about Chinese espionage activities against the US from Cuba, and reported overtures to Haiti by the notorious Russian Wagner Group, all have plainly illustrated the risks to US security that come from allowing dictatorships to proliferate and coordinate their activities. And I should just add that yesterday it was revealed that China and Cuba are also discussing military training on the island, which might bring Chinese troops to the island. Another comparatively underappreciated dimension is the role authoritarian alliances in helping dictators remain in power and repress their populations more effectively, accelerating mass irregular migration to the detriment of the region at large. The most dramatic example, of course, comes from Venezuela, where over 7.3 million people have left the country to escape Nicolas Maduro's gross mismanagement, misery, and repression. He remains in power, shored up by arms and intelligence from Russia, China, and Cuba, and a sanctions-evading oil trade with Iran. Nicaragua has also seen a dramatic uptick in outward migration, with 600,000 people fleeing since the murderous state crackdown in 2018, creating an acute crisis in neighboring Costa Rica, while U.S. apprehensions of Nicaragua at the southern border have multiplied by a factor of more than 50 in the last 2 years. Cuba, the longest-standing dictatorship in the hemisphere, continues to send migrants as the country's economy reels, and as the regime further clamps down on dissent following the massive protests held on the island in July 2021. The regime in Venezuela has taken advantage of the mass exodus of its people and the generous humanitarian responses from neighboring countries to send its spies abroad to continue to harass and persecute Venezuelan opposition figures in Colombia, for instance. Thus, a U.S. adversary has taken advantage of this human wave to conceal the entry of spies into a traditional U.S. ally. This begs the question of what more sophisticated U.S. adversaries like China and Russia might be doing to take advantage of the historic migration flows across the U.S. southern border. The presence of dictatorial regimes within the Western Hemisphere offers a springboard for extra-hemispheric authoritarians to expand their influence, co-opting, coercing, and manipulating other countries in the region to undermine their relations with the United States, often overpowering and empowering anti-democratic forces in the process. These challenges should not cause us to estimate the considerable advantages we still possess when it comes to geopolitical competition in the hemisphere. Latin America on the whole still looks to the U.S. as its preferred partner. If the U.S. seizes the opportunity to present a comprehensive, well-resourced counteroffer, the region will consider it seriously. Crafting such a response, however, will require a sustained and forward-looking strategy for engagement, which to date has unfortunately appeared lacking from the U.S. government, which has long turned to the region only in response to crisis and neglected it at other times. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Hernandez Roy. The chair now recognizes Ms. Brandt for her opening statement of 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Pfluger, Ranking Member Magaziner, distinguished members of the subcommittee, for inviting me to address you today on the threat posed by nation-state actors in Latin America to U.S. security. With geopolitical competition resurgent, considerable attention has been paid to Russian and Chinese playbooks and authoritarianism more broadly. As has been widely documented, Moscow and Beijing use a suite of low-cost, deniable tools and tactics to conduct influence operations designed to undermine their democratic competitors and make the world safe for illiberalism. But Russia and China each apply the toolkit differently in Latin America than in their respective home regions. And within Latin America, they operate distinctly from one another in ways that reflect their unique capabilities and goals. Developing a coherent strategy to push back on Russia and China's coercive activities depends on an appreciation of these nuances. Importantly, although Moscow and Beijing share certain near-term objectives, the two are operating on different trajectories and time horizons toward different long-term aims. Russia is a declining power by many measures, which seeks to disrupt the partnerships and institutions of its mostly Western competitor states here and now as a means of gaining relative advantage. With little to lose and perhaps something to gain for exposure from its asymmetric activities, it's not particularly sensitive to attribution. And seeing the benefits of chaos abroad, its efforts tend to be destructive. China, by contrast, is a rising power with a great deal to lose from having its coercive activities laid bare. It does not seek disorder, but rather a new order, more conducive to its interests, and so its efforts to change the status quo have tended to be more patient. These nuances carry over into the ways that Russia and China have conducted information operations targeting audiences in the region. Whereas for Russia, building influence in Latin America is a means to the end of disrupting Western alliances and institutions, for China, it's a means of building support for Beijing's way of doing business. Where Moscow has a long history of this sort of activity abroad, China's just beginning to experiment with information manipulation far afield. Russian state media almost never covers Russia. Chinese state media cover China a great deal. With that in mind, a word about Russia specifically. As you're likely aware, Moscow has made a concerted effort to promote its state media properties in Latin American audiences online, often with remarkable success. The Twitter account of RT en Español has more followers than RT's primary English language account and is retweeted nearly twice as often. On Facebook, RT en Español has more than twice the followers of RT's English language version and more followers than any other Spanish language international broadcaster. On TikTok, it's more popular than BBC Mundo, El País, and Univision. As it wages its assault on Ukraine, the Kremlin is putting these assets to use to erode support for Western countermeasures among Latin American publics, where opinion about the conflict appears up for grabs. For months, it has blamed Western sanctions for food and fuel shortages affecting the region. I know themes related to immigration are of interest to the committee. Interestingly, at least within the overt space, there's limited apparent evidence that the Kremlin proactively stokes chaos at the border. The top 5 most retweeted Spanish-language Russian state-backed messages on Twitter covering migration thus far this year offer praise for the Mexican president's handling of the issue. Immigration topics have surfaced in known covert information operations targeting the United States. That activity seems aimed at weaponizing politically divisive issue to exacerbate discord. It's not surprising, then, that some state-backed content on migration boosts domestic criticism of U.S. policy from both left and right. Unlike Russia, China's ultimate objective is to frame itself as a responsible global power, so its information operations primarily seek to build a positive view of Beijing and its leadership. Its propaganda casts democracy as feckless or hypocritical and highlights the strength of its governance model. Beijing uses immigration policy to cast the United States as hypocritical in its advocacy for human rights around the world. This is in keeping with its strategy of deploying whataboutism to deflect criticism of its own rights record. Distinguished members, the United States needs a strategy for pushing back on Russia and China's asymmetric activity in Latin America. It should reflect these nuances, be rooted in the United States' own considerable asymmetric advantages, and uphold democratic values, recognizing that those values are strengths. To that end, there are numerous steps that Washington can take to position the United States for success. Let me propose 3. First, recognizing the range and reach of Russia's information manipulation activity in Latin America, Washington should focus attention and resources on public diplomacy in the region. This could entail investing in U.S. AGM outlets targeted to Latin American audiences, ensuring that the Global Engagement Center is optimally equipped to track Russian propaganda activity there, and supporting research on related themes. It could also entail facilitating best practice exchanges with independent journalists, researchers, fact-checkers from across the hemisphere, and engaging democratic governments in the region to build resilience to a shared challenge. There are more than 40 million Spanish speakers in the United States, and U.S. security interests are directly tied to events in the region. Washington cannot afford to cede the information environment to its competitors. Second, Washington should conduct messaging campaigns grounded in truthful information to highlight the failures of repression to audiences in Latin America. These campaigns could build on the successes of the administration's novel strategy of downgrading intelligence related to the war in Ukraine. They could call attention to the fact that although Russia and China position themselves as anti-imperialist powers, both are pursuing an expansionist foreign policies. They might also highlight the costs of China's Belt Road Initiative to the region. Doing so is in keeping with the strategy of exploiting Putin and Xi's fragility to open information. Third, Washington must equip itself to see across the full threat picture, recognizing that Russian and Chinese coercive activities in Latin America and elsewhere are multidimensional. It's good, then, that Congress has established the Foreign Malign Influence Center within DNI to consolidate analysis of this problem set. It's also good that the center appears a resource to look at the full range of threats which go beyond elections. As it does all this, Washington should coordinate with partners and allies, because ultimately this is a contest over principles, and Washington's strong network of partners is perhaps its greatest advantage. Distinguished members, by drawing on a sophisticated picture of the complicated ways that Russia and China deploy coercive tools in Latin America and taking these steps that flow from it, Washington can position itself to protect its interests and the American people. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Brandt. And of note, this is the subcommittee's 6th hearing on Homeland Security on what we as a subcommittee are looking at. And I thank you all for your testimony. Members will now be recognized by order of seniority for their 5 minutes of questioning. An additional round of questioning may be called after all members have been recognized. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Mr. Hernandez Roy, a lot of interesting things that were that were said. Recent reports have indicated that the PRC has established and been operating a signals intelligence collection center in Cuba since 2019. Florida is home to a variety of military installations, sensitive military installations, is becoming an emerging technology leader, a financial services hub. There's so much going on there. Can you discuss what type of implications, security implications, that the PRC's collusion with Cuba, if these reports are true, what it actually means to the United States?
Well, the reports of some sort of spying activity in Cuba have been confirmed through a number of public sources, so I think we can take that for granted. The extent of the spying we don't know yet, at least we who look at it through the public information space. Having a signals intelligence operation in Cuba, it's based just south of Havana, 150 miles from U.S. mainland, is a significant threat, as it can collect information from the whole southeastern United States, in particular all of Southcom's activities in the south, and also CENTCOM in Tampa. So this would represent a significant threat, a significant gain for the Chinese in terms of their ability to monitor intelligence and monitor traffic of naval operations in the Caribbean, things of that nature. And it should be seen as a significant threat and a significant escalation on the part of the Chinese.
Well, thank you. This committee will be very active in understanding the depth of that threat and what it means to our homeland security, and I appreciate that. Ms. Dazinski, I'd like to focus on a couple of things when it comes to the southwest border. Number one, when we look at the fentanyl issue and understanding, we had a hearing recently, we examined the relationship between Mexican TCOs and Chinese crime syndicates and how these relationships enable the flow of fentanyl. Do you believe that the PRC is using America's fentanyl crisis as a gray zone tactic?
Thanks for the question. I think that at a minimum, there's passive engagement on the part of the PRC. They are well aware of the fentanyl challenge, and they're not doing much to help us stop that. Coordination from previous years has pretty much disappeared, even though there's a mound of evidence about the role of Chinese money laundering networks and manufacturers of precursor chemicals. So it's hard to understand why we can't engage more specifically on that issue, except that I think it's being viewed by the PRC as a strategic weapon against our country.
Wow. And you don't believe, in your recent article in the Miami Herald, you asserted that the U.S. must expose Chinese hidden hand in America's deadly fentanyl crisis, which you just alluded to, the money laundering aspect. So you believe we should be doing more as a whole of government approach.
Yes, exactly. The money laundering piece of this is critical. If we follow the money, I think we'll actually have an easier time addressing some of these challenges because it's so hard to interdict at the border. Fentanyl pills are small, they're mistaken for other types of commodities. It's extremely difficult to find them. Having said that, I know our Border Patrol is doing a better job, and our customs interdiction is doing a better job locating it. But having said that, following the money is probably the most important thing that we can do. There's been quite a bit written about the complexity of these money laundering operations, and what's unique about it is that there's this flow, this seamless flow between China, Mexico, and the U.S., and the role of money launderers here, Chinese money launderers working in the U.S. and selling U.S. dollar proceeds to Chinese nationals who want access to that money. It's incredible. So I'm happy to go into more detail on how that works, but I do think that this is the most important vector for us to look at.
Let me quickly jump to a related subject. There's no question in my mind that the PRC is exploiting the crisis at our southern border. It was reported yesterday that in this fiscal year, 127 people have entered this country apprehended, that's not gotaways, that have matched the terror watch list. Is the PRC exploiting the crisis at our southern border for their own personal gain?
I think we should assume that any vulnerabilities at our southern border are open for authoritarian influence of many kinds. I think that's a safe assumption. If the gaps are there, then those who are working against us are going to use them to their advantage.
Thank you. My time has expired. I now recognize the ranking member for his 5 minutes of question.
Thank you, Chairman. There's a lot to cover here, but first and foremost, we're in a competition for hearts and minds across the region. For the last 2 centuries, and particularly during the Cold War, America succeeded by maintaining strong relationships with allies in Latin America that allowed us to counter authoritarian threats, and we need to strengthen those relationships now. So, Ms. Brandt, can you just expand a little bit on what are some of the ways that Russia and China in particular are trying to win hearts and minds in Latin America, and then how can we as a nation best counter their efforts?
Both Russia and China bring large propaganda apparatuses that promote content that portrays their preferred narratives of polarizing political events. Both of them use other assets to try to, for Russia, I think most of its activity is aimed, as I said, at driving polarization and division within the United States. Its activities, I think, in Latin America are instrumental to its broader aim of weakening us from within. And I think that's in part to prevent us, if we're distracted and divided, it prevents us from playing a more forward-leaning role in the world that promotes our interests. And I think there is also an interest on the part of Russia in denting our soft power, making it harder again for us to exercise leadership in the world. For China, China comes in behind, Russia's efforts to sort of fracture the cohesion and the unity and appeal of democracies in order to present their model as a viable alternative. And both of these countries are doing that in the region.
And will they ever use U.S. voices to amplify their rhetoric? So, for example, if there are prominent U.S. individuals that talk about military strikes in Mexico or talk about, repeat Russian talking points with regard to the Ukraine invasion, will China or Russia take clips of Americans repeating those false and dangerous narratives and use them to try to win hearts and minds for China and Russia in Latin America?
Yeah, both Russia and China amplify domestic voices. I mean, as I've said, for Russia, this is primarily about stoking division and polarization within our country. For China, it's about sort of boosting the reach and resonance of its message, finding fellow travelers that add a sort of degree of legitimacy to these messages, and also like eliminate a layer of culpability.
Thank you, Ms. Dazinski. You wrote in your testimony about the significance of the CHIPS Act, CHIPS and Science Act, and other investments that the U.S. have made to try to bring more manufacturing and other economic activity back to this hemisphere. Can you just expand a little bit on that, on the importance of investments like those that are made in the CHIPS and Science Act, and also how we can better engage with our regional partners, again, to win hearts and minds through commerce here in our hemisphere?
Sure, thank you very much. There's no doubt that there's huge potential to utilize trade relationships and the potential for economic integration with both Mexico and into Latin America. And as companies think about whether they want to stay in China, and the government considers new mechanisms around outbound investment and other policies that might encourage pivoting out of China, supply chains, particularly critical ones, need to go somewhere. And the idea that we could have them closer to home is both valuable and attractive from an economic integration perspective. So it's almost like a perfect opportunity to look at new strategies to build those economic alliances, but mindful of the economic security objectives in doing so, that we want mutual benefit, we want security, we need trade facilitation, we want access to critical goods, particularly in the time of global shocks. Mexico is fairly well positioned for this, although not entirely. But as you go further south in the hemisphere, there's the chance, I think, that we'll miss this opportunity if we don't have the right security backbone in place. And this is a point that I wanted to make about the role of DHS and how important it is to ensure that we have that secure footprint which allows trade and commerce to be facilitated and ultimately has the right objective in terms of creating environments where people don't feel that they have to come to our border.
Yeah, and I know I'm running low on time, but I'll just emphasize again, China is going to Latin America and offering money and infrastructure and security. The United States has to counter that with more than rhetoric. We need to invest in these partnerships. Otherwise, our adversaries will be happy to fill that void. So I thank you all, and I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York. No stranger to law enforcement, former detective for the NYPD, Mr. D'Esposito.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everyone. I'm going to just take a minute to follow up on the chairman's remarks. I know he only had a few seconds left, but I think it's important to discuss and talk about. So obviously, it's no secret that authoritarian regimes relish in the opportunity to shine a spotlight and even encourage challenges for the United States of America. How might authoritarian regimes, including Venezuela, Cuba, Russia, and the PRC, take advantage of the current border crisis created by Joe Biden and Secretary Mayorkas that our nation is experiencing? And I'll really leave that for any of you.
Thank you, Congressman. I think, excuse me, I think there's a number of ways they can take advantage of what's happening at the southern border. First of all, just encourage migration from their own countries by cracking down on their populations, sending more people, creating more chaos, sowing more division within the United States on how to effectively respond. That is one way they're clearly doing it. The other way, presumably, which I've provided an example in the Venezuelan context, and one of my colleagues has said it's a distinct possibility, is they can be taking advantage of the massive amounts of people, 2.4 million interventions last year. Within that space of 2.4 million people, you can try to get people that are undesirable, that are going to work for the interests of these regimes in the United States. So I think that's a vulnerability. I have no direct evidence of that happening. I have mentioned direct evidence of that happening in the Venezuelan context, sending spies to Colombia. It's a distinct possibility that the United States needs to be taking seriously.
I'll just add one angle to this that I think we need to consider. So as we see increased engagement in places like Venezuela with Iran, Russia, we should be mindful of the potential that local populations may become part of extremist movements, and that could be fueled by this increasing engagement from authoritarian interests in these countries. How do we relate that to what's happening at the southwest border? Well, it's much as Chris has identified, which is with the massive inflow of people, we have the needle in the haystack problem again, to try to figure out who those extremists might be. We have an identity management problem at the border, and somehow we need to figure that out, because it's going to become more and more difficult as we're trying to manage an influx of legitimate economic migrants and political migrants from a place like Venezuela. How do we know if we're allowing for extremist threats to come into the country? So we're going to have to be more sophisticated about figuring that out.
I agree. I think that, sorry.
Well, I was just going to add, from my analysis, which again is focused on the open source space, I see this less as Russia trying to drive populations to the border as much as it is to weaponize, the polarizing nature of debates within this country around migration. But again, we don't know what we don't know, and I think the challenge for us, is to sort of think capaciously about the challenges so that we can get ahead of them without also making Russia 10 feet tall.
So obviously there are real threats, whether it's the regimes, whether it's our open border. I know some would like to argue that climate change is our biggest threat, but I think these pose a bigger threat to our country and our freedoms than anything else. And just to follow up on what we talked about, because I truly believe that this is also a threat. What's your thoughts on the CCP and the fact that there have been stories that they would embed assets into larger groups of nationals making the journey from China to Mexico or other areas along our southwest border.
Well, since I mentioned that was a possibility, I guess I'll try to answer that. I have, like Ms. Brandt, I mean, we work on public information, so I have no direct information on that. But I go back to the example that has happened in other cases. And I just wanted to add something to my previous intervention, which is that Venezuela has been known publicly to have sold passports to Hezbollah operatives and to bring people out of Syria as well with Venezuelan passports. So that's another potential vulnerability. People from that part of the region using Venezuelan passports, where are they going?
Right, and probably not going there to do good things. My time has expired. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, my good friend, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate this hearing. It's very timely and very important, and thank the witnesses for being here today. I hear your statements. Latin America are challenges, and we talk about an open border. We talk about regimes. I didn't hear a lot of talk about poverty, the challenges in Latin America. Okay, and alternatives. Talk about history a little bit. The Pan American Highway was built in the 40s, 20s, 30s, and through the 50s, and we essentially financed the construction of that highway south of Mexico through Panama, almost to Panama, except for the Darien Gap, because of our strategic interest in fighting against communism. Okay, Honduras has a 4-lane highway. You know who paid for that? The United States of America. We have forgotten the role that we played in the Americas throughout history. That has been our area of national interest. And today we wake up, last 3 years, China has signed more than 30 agreements with Latin America, free trade agreements, okay? 20 Latin American nations signed on to China's Belt and Road Initiative. I'm trying to figure out what's going on. Is our private sector asleep at the wheel? We have this challenge of these precious metals that China is controlling around the world. They're part of Latin America, and nobody is discussing these issues. I'm at a loss here. Ms. Dazinski, you mentioned DHS stepping up. Apparently our private sector's not doing a good job. So I guess we as legislators need to take your recommendations and move forward because, you know, China, Russia, Iran, I don't care what those folks are doing. I care about what is in our power to do. Our power is to move forward. And we're sitting here pointing fingers at them. If you want to win a race, you focus on your lane. Don't be chasing the other person. Focus on we can do the best. In Latin America, 20, 30 years ago, when you would see a food box that said donations from America, the goodwill that was there was tremendous. Tremendous. Where is that going today? Have we forgotten the lectures, the lessons of history? Only have 2 minutes, but I want to give you an example. We talk about the Cuban electronic espionage base by China. My understanding, please fact check me, that was actually started operating in 1999, and that was actually upgraded in 2019. Let's think about history of Cuba, okay? Obama lifted some of the restrictions, trade with Cuba. Cuba's private sector exploded. 2017, Trump administration reversed that position and added additional few other restrictions. President Biden has essentially followed the Biden model. I'm trying to figure out what's the incentives that we are giving folks in this hemisphere to work with the United States. I'm going to open it up to the three of you. in the 1 minute that I have to help us figure out a roadmap here, because I don't like the fact that our American influence in our backyard is going down the drain. Thank you.
Thank you so much. There's so many things to bring up in response to all of your good points. I would just make the following. Number one, with regard to the private sector, we need to do a better job of...
I mean, you know, and I'll give you here an example. Venezuela. Well, you can throw rocks at what's going on in Venezuela. I don't like the fact that probably the world's largest oil reserves are now under the influence of China and Russia. What are we doing to counter that? Very quick, specific question. What are we doing to get back our influence in that area of the world? More sanctions?
I would suggest that we need to de-risk to make it easier for Western companies and Western investment to go into the region. Part of
Is
the
that
problem,
in our power, or is that in Venezuela's power, Russia's power,
Oh,
or China's power?
It's absolutely in our power. It's a very positive step that we could take.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'm out of time. Thank you very much for indulging me, sir.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Arizona, a Navy SEAL, Mr. Crane, for his 5 minutes of questions.
Mr. Chairman, if I may interrupt you, I wanted to ask unanimous consent that Ms. Jackson Lee be permitted to sit with us in this subcommittee and be part of the question. Thank you.
Yes. The chair will entertain that, and thank you, Ms. Jackson Lee, for showing up. And now, Mr. Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all our guests and panelists who have come here today. I wanted to know if any of you guys saw the article in yesterday's Associated Press titled "Pentagon Accounting Error Provides Extra $6.2 Billion for Ukraine Military Aid." Anybody see that headline? Anybody read that story? No? Okay. Are you guys aware that to date, the U.S. has sent $113 billion to Ukraine? Anybody? Okay. Does it surprise you guys when you see stories like that? You know, accounting error, $6.2 billion to Ukraine. Accounting error up here to the tune of $6.2 billion. Mr. Roy, does it surprise you when you see errors to that extent?
An error of that magnitude could only be justified if the economy of the United States was, you know, hundreds of trillions of dollars. It's a rather surprising headline, I would say.
Thank you. You know, as I listen to your testimonies and knowledge about some of the unrestricted and asymmetric warfare right here in our own Western Hemisphere, down in Latin America by the Chinese, Russians, and Iranians, I want to ask you guys, does it bother any of you when we see all this money going to someplace over in Europe that, you know, happens to be a very corrupt country that most Americans can't even point to on a map, when we have all this nefarious activity going on right in our own backyard? I want to start with you, Ms. Brandt.
I think we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. I mean, I think the challenges that we face in our hemisphere are enormous, and as I've argued, we need to pay more attention there. And I also think Ukraine is on the front lines of the conflict between democracies and authoritarian challengers.
Yeah, that seems to be the general consensus in this town. The problem is, ma'am, when you talk about walking and chewing gum at the same time, you have to take into account that the United States of America has about $32 trillion in debt. Right? So we don't even have this money that we continue to send over in Ukraine. Do you see that as a problem, ma'am?
You know, as I've said, I think our support for Ukraine is important and consequential to our national security interests. It's fundamental.
Okay. What about our national debt? Do you think that's important?
That's beyond my expertise.
It's actually pretty common sense. What about you, Ms. Dazinski? What do you think about our national debt and this idea up in this town that, you know, we can continue to spend hundreds of billions of dollars of the American taxpayers' money that we don't even have, yet let alone when you look at some of these threats that we're talking about in Latin American countries right in our backyard, we don't seem to have the resources to, you know, make sure that our own border security is in order and secure.
I think the most challenging thing about the threats in Latin America and perhaps even at the southwest border is that for years we've probably underestimated it. And it seems like, what we're dealing with now is the equivalent of a soft underbelly in the Western Hemisphere. And that will require us to think a little bit more strategically and creatively about what Latin America policy should be, how we bring together more resources around economic security, and how we balance that out with what we have to do in the rest of the world.
Thank you, ma'am. Mr. Hernandez Roy, are you familiar with the saying, peace through strength?
Pardon me, could you repeat that, please?
Are you familiar with the saying, peace through strength?
Vaguely, yes.
What do you think the opposite of that would be, Mr. Hernandez Roy?
War through weakness.
Yeah, war, chaos through weakness. That is exactly where we find ourselves right now. War, chaos, because of weakness. We're facing a world on fire because of weakness, incompetence, and internal corruption. I want to read this for the American people that might be watching this. Hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. We are all aware that our current leadership is pretty weak. Falls in public regularly, struggles to put sentences together, and is embroiled in multiple layers of corruption. My point is this: elections have consequences. If we want to continue to see this global dumpster fire continue, then we should, by all means, keep this current administration in place. If we want to return to peace through strength, we must reinstall somebody who projects strength and puts America and Americans first. Thank you all for coming. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Goldman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for having this hearing, and I certainly hope my colleague from Arizona will look to reduce our deficit by examining our $860 billion defense budget. I want to focus a little bit right now on what gives China and Russia the opportunity to have such significant influence in Latin America. And I'm not actually sure which one of you is sort of the best or the foremost expert among the panel in terms of the upheaval, disarray, and cratering governmental issues that are going on in Latin America, especially Central America. But in the last 2 to 4 years, Ms. Dazinski, you seem to be focused on this. Can you describe a little bit about what's been going on in terms of upheaval in governments in Central and Latin America?
Thank you for the question. Let me talk a little bit about China. You've asked about China and Russia in the region and how they're exerting that influence and how that came to be and maybe what the implications are for governments in the region. I'll take on the China piece of this, which is very much driven by their brilliant use of their trade relationships.
I'm sorry, I just want to interrupt because I think we have a lot of attention, and you all have spoken very much on how China infiltrates and influences, and they're doing the same thing in Africa as well. But I want to talk a little bit about the political situation, the governmental upheaval in the countries in, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, Guatemala, to name a few, and there are others. Maybe Mr. Hernandez Roy, you want to talk a little bit about what's been going on in the last 2 to 4 years in that region that has also caused so many more citizens from there to seek refuge in other countries?
Well, I think there's a couple of points to be made that aren't necessarily totally related, but why so many people are seeking refuge is because they're living under dictatorial regimes. They're being oppressed, they're being persecuted, they're being arbitrarily detained, people who have nothing to do with political activism just because they might be in the wrong place at the wrong time or being imprisoned. Venezuela, for the last 10 years, has had a revolving door of at least 300 political prisoners. Since the massive protests in 2014 and again in 2017, something like 16 or 17,000 people have been detained in Venezuela. In Nicaragua, since 2018, during the protests of 2018, there were 355 people that were murdered by the regime. Since then, journalists, civil society activists, students, over 400 NGOs have lost their legal personality. 600,000 people have fled the country. That's what's going on in those regimes. But going back a little further, talking about the political upheaval, if you go back 20 years, Latin America, 20 years ago and today, is a profoundly unequal part of the world, probably the most unequal if you look at Gini coefficients. And populists in that part of the world, particularly Hugo Chavez, were able to leverage that discontent and use Venezuela's massive oil wealth at the time. This was before the economic collapse in Venezuela and when oil prices were sky high, to spread the wealth around, to keep like-minded politicians, both in Venezuela and in friendly countries abroad, in power, to create friends through corruption. There's a well-known Petrocaribe and Petrofraude scheme where billions, if not hundreds of billions of Venezuelan petrodollars were spread around the region. And if you look at the region 10 years ago, there was one dictatorship. You look at the region today, there's 3 dictatorships. There's at least 2 semi-authoritarian regimes that are on the way to becoming dictatorships. And there's one completely failed state, which is Haiti. Against the backdrop of all that chaos, Russia and China have multiple opportunities to get involved. They have at least the Russians have ideological affinity with many of these populist movements. The Chinese are more pragmatic. They're really primarily interested in business and making money and securing primary commodities for their economy. But I think all of that history, both 20 years ago and more recent, is what is the upshot of what you're seeing today.
Thank you for that explanation. And Ms. Brandt, I just have a couple seconds, but I'm curious how you would view that vacuum to provide the opportunity, especially, I know your expertise is more Russia, how Russia can interfere and influence those regimes.
We'll do about 20 seconds here.
I guess I would just say very quickly, to the extent that Russia's and China's coercive economic activity and political subversive activity, make governments less responsive to their citizens. They undermine rule of law. They facilitate corruption. I think they, speaking to your question, I think they contribute to the root causes of migration. And so,
and they exacerbate the situation that already exists.
Yeah, I think Russia's by no means responsible, but it's not helping.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for indulging me.
Expired.
I yield back.
Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Mr. Chairman, first of all, let me thank you and the ranking member for your courtesies. I'm deeply involved and interested in this long-running story of our interaction with those who have become adversaries. Let me say to Mr. Christopher Hernandez Roy, you view it as important for us to be engaged with South and Central America, do you not?
Yes, ma'am.
We have adversaries, but we need to be a major positive force in those regions. Would you agree that this era of our time is one of the greatest migrations that any of us may have seen coming from that part of the hemisphere?
I would agree, ma'am, that we are at historic times in terms of migration in the entire region, not necessarily just from Central America.
Absolutely, and I said Central and South America.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, and I appreciate that because we are actually in an era, in a decade, maybe 2, of the greatest migration, at least of this current era around the world. I mean, I've watched flows of traffic going from many different places. And I make that point as I pursue my line of questioning. And I thank this committee for this hearing, because we do need to counter bad guys in Latin America, in Iran, Russia, and otherwise other places as well. Is that I was really baffled by a filing of articles of impeachment for what is really both a historical fact and will not be solved by impeachment. The late John McCain tried to solve it, as we did, joining with him, by comprehensive immigration reform. You do note that that is valuable. I'll just answer my own question on that. Let me pursue important line of reasoning for China and Russia, and let me ask Ms. Brandt, if you would, and Iran. I thought we had Iran in this discussion, but if not, I'm going to add it to the discussion. We have countries like France and Albania stopping freedom-loving Iranians from peacefully protesting or having meetings, suggesting that Iran now is spreading its wings to intimidate those nations that have to receive its oil products. What is your interpretation of that power that they're using to denounce democracy around the world and as a tyrannical nation?
Well, Russia, China, and Iran, I think, are all interested in denting the prestige of liberal democracy around the world. It's a part of a tactic to, I think, make democracy less appealing to would-be rights advocates at home, and so helping autocrats to tighten their grip on power, which I think is fundamentally in their self-interest. And then again, it's about, sort of weakening their global competitors. You mentioned comprehensive immigration reform, and I would say there's another way that this connects with the conversation that we're having today, which is I'm mindful of Kennan's sort of admonition that we need to sort of resist the temptation to become that against like which we are coping, or something to that effect. And the idea here is that, we need to lead into our own asymmetric strengths in this asymmetric competition, and our vibrant, open society is one of them. And this, we've been.
I have another question, so it'll allow you to
Sure,
finish your point on that. So basically, we should lean in when these countries are trying to tamp down democracy, and we should lean in our friends in France and Albania in terms of denying that free speech for those Iranians. I would hope that would be the case. But let me also talk about some of the tactics that Russia has used. Certainly the Ukraine war is dastardly and devastating, not instigated by the United States or the Western world. They have taken to using hostages to extract and strangle relationships with foreign countries. Would you comment on this hostage approach so that America knows we shouldn't be intimidated by that and we should fight hard for our hostages to be returned? And I guess this way you can finish your overall point. And then with China, it's all about the technology and artificial intelligence, the meeting of Secretary Blinken. How do we frame our lean in to those issues and those countries?
Yes, I think that's where I was going, which is that there's another layer to this competition, which is not just within the information domain, but within the technology domain. And there it's essential that we, again, lean into our strengths, which is our vibrant, open innovation economy. And our immigration policy is relevant to that, because we want to make sure that we are the top, we have an edge in talent. It's critically important, and we want to make sure that we maintain that edge by being an attractive place for talent to come.
Well, the hostages situation.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Nevada, Ms. Titus.
Well, thank you very much. I apologize for being late. I hope I don't repeat something. But I sit on the Foreign Affairs Committee, and so we hear a lot about the malign influences of China and Russia, Russia more politically, China more economically. In fact, we just heard about China building the port in Lima, so we know the Belt and Road extends all over the world. But I'd like to ask you about China's relations with Taiwan and how they respond to other countries in Latin America as they, in turn, have different affairs with Taiwan. Recently, I believe that Secretary Blinken said that we don't support independence of Taiwan. I don't know how that's going to play in Latin America, but we know that Latin America's support for Taiwan has been waning. It's now down to 7 countries, I think, and coupled with China's authoritarian regime relations with such governments as Cuba and Venezuela, I wonder how this is going to impact our push for democracy in Latin America, or our just even trade relations between the U.S. and Latin American countries, as they tend to lean more in the direction of China over the Taiwan issue. Anybody?
Yes, there's no doubt that, as you correctly said, there are still, the largest number of Taiwan allies are in Latin America globally. You're correctly about the number of 7. Taiwan recently lost one ally in March. Honduras switched allegiance from Taiwan to the PRC, which had been a campaign promise of that country's president. There are the largest 2 countries that are still allies of Taiwan are in the Western Hemisphere, Guatemala and Paraguay. Guatemala is about to have an election. The issue of whether it will continue to recognize Taiwan is, I think, up in the air. Paraguay did recently have an election, and I think for the time being it is secure in its continuing relationship with Taiwan and not the PRC. But this is clearly one of the objectives of the PRC in the region, is to continue to peel away Taiwan's allies.
Anybody else? Well, thank you. I think that's something we ought to keep a look at. My other question is about regime change. You know, China and Russia are using different tactics, overt and covert, to influence countries in Latin America. The U.S. doesn't have a very good history of this. If we don't like them, we've gone in and tried to overthrow them. This is particularly true, again, for Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. So how do we try to counter China's influence, offer an alternative, and still deal with that history of meddling that's many people have long memories about?
Thank you for the question. I think this is a particularly challenging problem for us. When China engages with countries, particularly in the global south, they typically employ their policy of non-interference, which means they come ostensibly to engage in economic integration. They'll work with whatever regime is in power. They'll often play by local rules, which could facilitate how China uses opaque contracts, employs corruption, any number of tools that cater particularly to weak democracies or authoritarian regimes where there's more likelihood that opacity will kind of drive the conversation and rule the day. So I think we have a real challenge in terms of how to counter that. We need to get at those issues first and foremost by protecting our own interests, our own capital, our engagement, staying true to our democratic values, pushing on anti-corruption, stopping the money laundering, calling out the bad behavior. Because if we don't do that, we've really lost the game. We really need to focus on these governance principles. But then we need to take it a step further, which is show up in the region for the long term with the right kind of economic commitments to drive that kind of economic security that we were talking about earlier, and maybe in the process keep some supply chains closer to home.
We don't want to force them to make a choice. We don't want to put it in those contexts, but we want to let them know they have options, these are countries. Thank you. I think my time is up. I yield back.
Generally, his time has expired. We'll now enter a second round of questioning. Again, alternating sides based on seniority here. The chair now recognizes myself for 5 minutes of questioning. I think it's been a great discussion so far. I'm incredibly worried about what the PRC is doing, the Chinese Communist Party. Not only is, right at our doorstep, I mean, they are literally inside our country in a lot of different ways. I think the Chinese spy balloon highlighted that. This subcommittee held a hearing on that. We're hearing today the vast array of initiatives that the CCP is using, economic, militarily, influence and information operations campaigns. The fact that we now know, which is completely unacceptable, that they have a surveillance and spy machine that is ongoing inside Cuba, which is less than 100 miles away from our shores. And I think for all these reasons, it really is incredibly important that we focus on it. And Ms. Dazinski, in your written testimony, as well as in your responses to questions here, you talk about the true autocratic behemoth in the region, China, which has ramped up its economic investment throughout the hemisphere, driving debt dependency, anti-democratic vision of surveillance states. You talk about the critical minerals that they are acquiring inside Latin America. You talk about the 29 different ports that they have established. I mean, they are literally knocking at our doorstep. And I'd like to really further investigate your ideas. And previously in your testimony, you talked about you were there when we stood up DHS. It was created to have a more unified whole-of-government approach to counter new and emerging asymmetric terrorist threats. These threats are right there. So what is that approach, economically, specifically, and also militarily, if you have any thoughts on that?
Thank you so much. The approach is, for certain, a multifaceted one. We really need to think about this from a whole-of-government picture. We'll never have the centralized industrial policy focus that China has, but arguably we don't need it if we use all of the tools in our own toolkit to bring a combination of security, investment, economic integration, better political engagement with allies and friends and partners in the region. All of this needs to work together. We need a big strategy around this. In terms of the more specific actions that could be taken around some of these threats that we've identified around port security, for example, we really need to get a handle on these nodes of commerce where we see this layering of technology, surveillance, infrastructure investment, the potential to use commercial operations to support military, the transport of military supplies, for example. There are a lot of vulnerabilities in this, this commerce structure, this commerce ecosystem that connects into the DHS agenda very, very closely. But I'm not sure that we've really made the pivot around that operational readiness, that we've taken the analysis and the intelligence, that big picture, and then, you know, is it being driven by the right boots on the ground, the right engagement? So there's multi-facets to this, but I think we need to get at an asymmetric approach where we identify what those most critical elements of Chinese influence are and go after them. We're not going to compete in terms of the size of our trade relationships. We just won't be everywhere that China is. And frankly, we don't have to be. We don't have to spend as much money through some equivalent of the Belt and Road Initiative, but we need to use those tools that we have in a much more effective way.
Ms. Brandt, it seems to me over the past 10 to 20 years that we have been ignoring our neighbors to the south in many ways. And it seems that during that time, the People's Republic of China, led by the Chinese Communist Party, have just inched their way into that territory with a goal of influencing you know, those countries in a way that undermines our own national security. Are you seeing something similar to that?
Yeah. Concerns about terrorism and resurgent geopolitical competition have, you know, shifted the focus to the Middle East and to Asia, and to some extent we've deprioritized engagement in our own region. And, you know, as all of us have described here today, I think we're the poorer for it.
Mr. Hernandez Roy, you've got 12 seconds left.
I think the Chinese motivation is primarily economic, but it's from a power that is obviously a communist dictatorship. And with that comes corruption, comes anti-democratic practices, and that leads to, it opens up spaces for all sorts of nefarious things to go on.
And those nefarious things are killing 100,000 Americans a year through fentanyl. They're creating chaos, money laundering, criminal organizations, destabilizing the region just to the south of us. And I appreciate your testimony here. I hope that this committee can urge our colleagues throughout the rest of Congress to take the actions that you're recommending and to do more when it comes to securing our own country through the stabilization in the South and Central America. And with that, my time has expired. I recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Another aspect of this that I'd like to focus on for a moment is the importance of rare earth minerals, particularly lithium and others. No coincidence that we're seeing China make investments in commerce and diplomacy in areas around the world that are rich in these rare earth minerals, including in South America in particular. And you know, Ms. Dazinski, I noticed that you touched on this in your testimony and others. Could you just expand on that a bit more? What is happening with rare earth minerals in South America, and what should we as a nation be doing in order to prevent our adversaries from cornering the market, essentially, for these important rare earth minerals?
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, we have a big challenge in Latin America. As I've noted in my testimony, the so-called lithium triangle of Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile is home to over half of the world's known lithium reserves, and China has been working to corner that market. U.S. companies have had, to date, somewhat limited success. There was a bid put forward by a U.S. Group of companies in the last year or so, and it was beat out by a Chinese conglomerate and under some strange circumstances where the U.S. bid was knocked out, because it was submitted 10 minutes late or something. Something strange like that. So there's a lot of competition going on right at the source of this. We have not been in an ideal position to address it from a political perspective because China has really leveraged its relationships, its trade relationships to support its interests. And because China is the processing behemoth, with 65% of the refining capacity around lithium in particular, it's very difficult to break that. One thing that we will need to look at is how to do so, whether it's moving some processing to the US or working with partners in the region to identify other areas of processing. This could be an asymmetric opportunity for us. We need to get at the point in the supply chain that is most critical, and processing is really a key part of that.
Thank you. Switching gears a bit, Mr. Hernandez Roy, in an article that you co-authored, you remarked that among U.S. presidents, President Biden has shown some of the most knowledge and appreciation for Latin America, and one of the examples that you cited in the article was the decision to invite the Brazilian and Colombian presidents to the United States within their respective first years in office. Brazil and Colombia historically have been two of our most important allies in the hemisphere. Can you talk a little bit about what more we could be doing to strengthen our relationships with Brazil and with Colombia in particular, and why those relationships are so important in the context of competition with our autocratic competitors?
Absolutely, and if I may, just very, very quickly on your last question with regard to critical minerals, and Argentina specifically, and its lithium deposits, which are some of the largest. Argentina's exporting about 9% of its lithium to the United States, and something like 49%, if memory serves, to China. I've been told by representatives of that government that they'd prefer it to be the other way around, but that's just the way the economics are right now. And the IRA Act provides incentives to countries that have FTA agreements with the United States in terms of critical minerals. Argentina does not have an FTA agreement and is seeking an exemption under that. So that's one thing that the United States could do to counter Chinese influence. With regard to your other question, Brazil and Colombia, as you've pointed out correctly, is a long-standing U.S. partner and ally, dating back to the 90s when Colombia was at risk of being overrun by narco-trafficking. The United States invested heavily in that country and it became one of its closest allies, beating back the security threat to Colombia and building up its democracy. It remains a key ally in the United States, despite a change of posture by this particular government in terms of its outlook. Brazil is the largest economy in Latin America and obviously is an important trading partner with the United States, but it's also an important trading partner with China. And therefore, in fact, I think the chairman earlier alluded to the fact that, well, he said Latin America as a whole. I'm not sure that's entirely accurate, but I'm pretty confident at this point that China is Brazil's largest trading partner. And therefore, we have an interest to strengthen relationship with Brazil, to find ways to compete with China in Brazil.
My time has expired. Thank you.
Gentlemen's time's expired. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Hernandez Roy, as was mentioned by some of my colleagues, our weakness or the view of this country being weak or administration being weak has led to threats. The PRC's role in Latin America has grown rapidly since 2000. The PRC state firms are major investors in Latin America's energy, infrastructure, and space industries. And I just want to give you some numbers. By 2021, PRC trade in the region totaled $450 billion, and economists predict that it could exceed $700 billion by 2035. Of particular concern, and as was discussed, the PRC's infrastructure in the region has displayed dual use that could have security implications for this great country. Could you explain the concept of dual use infrastructure and the impact the facilities could have on Homeland Security?
Sure, I can mention at least 3 specific examples. The Chinese now control the loading and unloading facilities in the Panama Canal. They're building, it's almost finished, a very large port in Peru. Last week, if I'm not mistaken, they inked an agreement with the regional government of Tierra del Fuego in the very southern tip of Argentina to build a port that would control the Drake Strait, I think that's the name of the strait. It would control access to the fishing fields off of Antarctica. And then it has, again in Argentina, it has a spaceport in Argentina that's ostensibly for research and to track Chinese satellites. It is essentially a piece of sovereign Chinese territory within Argentina. The Argentine authorities cannot even set foot on this property. Each one of those things has a dual use. They have a peaceful use for commerce, for research, for scientific research, and for the movement of trade goods. But each one of them can also be used in a second capacity. This is where the term dual use comes from, for military capacity. The Chinese space station can be used to track US satellites. It could be conceivably used to track intercontinental ballistic missiles. Ports can be used as refueling and supply and logistics hubs for Chinese warships. Ports can be closed. Facilities can be sabotaged in the event of a conflict. The Panama Canal is obviously one of the most strategically important areas in the hemisphere. So each of those investments, each of those pieces of infrastructure that the Chinese have either bought or built has a dual use.
Thank you. So obviously it's a real threat. What do you believe that this committee and our colleagues in this Congress could do to deter and to really get a handle on this, on the dual use infrastructure that's causing a threat to this nation?
That's not an easy, there's not an easy solution to
Not
that.
in a minute and 44 seconds.
I think the easiest thing to do is to prevent it before it happens. So in that sense, the United States can do a number of things. It can provide new mechanisms or fix old mechanisms to have more development financing in the region. For instance, the DFC is prevented from providing financing to middle and upper income countries. It can only provide financing to lower and lower middle income countries. There's only 5 countries that qualify as lower and lower middle income countries in Latin America. They're all in Central America. However, it's well known that there are huge disparities within a country in terms of their economic development. So changes to those rules, for instance, could allow more financing to some of the South American countries to counter some of the infrastructure financing from China. The United States can replenish the capital in the Inter-American Development Bank. That's another large multilateral institution, can provide more lending for infrastructure in the region. There's examples like that in my, I'm over the time, but those are the kinds of things that the United States can do to prevent these dual-use things from being built in the first place.
Thank you very much. I now recognize Mr. Correa from California for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to, my 5 minutes that I have, really ask all of you for your opinion. It's a big topic, a lot of ways we can go, but specifically, how does Department of Homeland Security, what are some of the actions that we can take to begin to turn the ship around, so to speak? You mentioned, and I agree with you, investment in the area. I would prefer a Marshall Plan that is, accompanied by some economic reform, anti-corruption, but that's a big picture. Specifically here today, Homeland Security, I'm going to ask each one of you, what can we do to begin to address, to begin to bring attention to what I believe is, 20, 30 years of being asleep at the wheel? Ms. Dazinski.
Thank you. One thing that really strikes me about where we are now facing these economic security threats, a broader range of threats to the homeland, is how much of what was built after 9/11 has kind of fallen by the wayside. Let me give you an example. After 9/11, we spent a lot of time thinking about how to secure the ports. We had something called the Container Security Initiative. We had the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism. We had a number of international engagements that exerted U.S. leadership and provided a basis for much more strategic engagement with partners around the world. Some of that we've lost, and I think we need to get back to a more strategic footprint, whether we're putting people on the ground or we're using the, quote unquote, digital boots on the ground, some combination of these things. We need more eyes and ears, and we need to drive that footprint based on a better analysis of where the threats are and where we need to have that deeper engagement. We have the opportunity to do that at ports. We can do that with key players in the supply chain. We can do that through better interagency coordination, and all of these things need to happen.
Mr. Hernandez Roy.
Thank you, Congressman. Commenting on DHS is really beyond my expertise, but what I will say, you mentioned a couple of things. You mentioned the Marshall Plan. The U.S. influence in Latin America was probably at its highest in the 1960s, after President Kennedy launched something called the Alliance for Progress, which was essentially a Marshall Plan for the region. It provided development assistance on a massive scale. At the time, it was the largest development assistance package that the United States had ever implemented, and it had significant effects on reducing poverty in the region, which is something you mentioned earlier. I would also say that what the United States needs to do is create better conditions in the region to prevent threats from washing up on our shores. So that it goes back to this idea of an alliance for progress, and we have argued, we at CSIS, some of us have argued that the U.S. should entertain a new alliance for progress, or 2.0, at some point.
Ms. Brandt.
So I said in my testimony that China and Russia both apply the coercive toolkit in Latin America differently than in their home regions. And China in particular, at home, closer to home, it's really weaponizing the leverage that it has as its own region's largest trading partner. But abroad, it's really patiently building leverage that it can sort of use later. And so we're closer to home, those countries have sort of faced the sharpest, or like the brunt, the sharpest elements of China's toolkit. Farther abroad, I think they've really benefited in some ways from China's use of, inducements, positive inducements. And so I think the task for us is to both provide alternatives, as you've suggested, and then also to tell a more compelling story about what we offer, right? Ultimately, competition is about the pursuit and use of advantages. And so just sort of rather than a tit-for-tat reactive approach, to authoritarian moves, we need to do an assessment of what our own strengths are, and I think go at, authoritarians where they're weak. And I think one such fragility is to open information.
One final quick question here to all of you. You mentioned the popularity of TikTok, social media. I think probably 90%, about 70% of the world uses a smartphone. Latin America is the same thing. Great communication device. You have a lot of Latin Americans living in the United States. You have a lot of cross-cultural influence. How can we use that, what I would call continuing American goodwill, to really influence and try to continue to integrate this continent the way it was before, I should say? Please.
Yeah, I mean, we have 40 million native Spanish speakers in the United States, and some of the best content creators in the world. So we should be leveraging those assets, especially in our communication in the region, right? I'm thinking about like low-cost content distribution agreements that would allow some of our, content to be shown in the region, for example.
In my last 25 seconds, in your opinion, the three of you, kind of a yes or no question, is Congress doing enough to make sure that we're present in Latin American countries? That is, are we visiting enough? Are we paying enough attention? Yes, no. 5 seconds.
Yeah, I would just say it's incredibly important that we focus attention and resources.
Are we putting enough attention? Yes, no.
I think there's more we can do.
Sir?
I think there's more we can do, and not just Congress, but also the executive.
Ms. Dazinski?
There's more that we can do.
Thank you very much. The chair, I yield.
Thank you, sir. The gentleman's time's expired. I now recognize my friend from Arizona, Mr. Crane.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, I realize we're talking about Latin American countries today and the influence of China, Russia, and Iran down there. That being said, I do want to ask a question. Is anybody on the panel aware how many men conducted the attacks on the World Trade Center during 9/11? Anybody? Anybody know the number?
Sorry,
Mr.
could
Roy?
you repeat the number of, pardon me, the number of what?
The number of men who conducted the attacks on the World Trade Center. Anybody know the answer to that? How many?
Men?
How many terrorists?
It was somewhere in the neighborhood of 12 to 20, I
It
believe.
was
Yeah.
about 17.
Yeah, it was around that 19 men. The reason I bring that up is because in 2021, CBP reported 4,103 encounters of Russian citizens along our southwest border. It continues to increase. Following the start of the war in Ukraine, this number jumped from 21,763 in 22, and then in 2023, it rose again to 33,000. Now let's go to China. In the first 3 months of 2023, we saw 9,711 individuals coming from China encountered at our southern border. That obviously doesn't count the number of gotaways, which we can't count, but it's substantially more than the 3 years. Since, again, we're in Homeland Security, does it concern anybody on the panel, knowing the current state of our southern border, to see these numbers increasing from the very countries that we're talking about in our southern hemisphere? Mr. Roy, does it concern you to hear those numbers increasing?
I think there's a two-part answer to that.
Okay.
The numbers are increasing in part, large part, because there are freedom-loving people in those countries
Absolutely.
who also want to leave their repressive regimes and come to the
We
United
understand that. We all understand that. But does it concern you just knowing how I opened with it only took 19 individuals to conduct one of the greatest attacks on U.S. soil ever?
It is a concern of mine, given my experience within the region and what other dictatorships have done in the region to infiltrate spies into neighboring allies.
Absolutely. Do you guys think that either China or Russia might be smart enough to figure out that our southern border is pretty porous? And even our own president, while he was a candidate, said, if you want to come to the United States, come. Do you think that, does that concern you? How about you, Ms. Dazinski? Sorry if I pronounced that wrong.
No, it was fine. Thank you. Yes, it is a concern. When the vulnerabilities are known, they can be exploited. As the immigration flow continues to grow, it becomes a more difficult challenge to figure out the very small number of people within a very large number coming across the border that are actually of security interest and concern. This is a problem we've had for a very long time.
Yep. Let me ask a follow-on, ma'am. Do you think that we should continue, do you think we should finish the wall that we started building on our southern border?
It's probably outside of my scope to comment specifically on the wall because I'm not following where things are at. But I do firmly believe that we need to be able to control the border.
Okay. Ms. Brandt, what about you?
I mean, like Ms. Dazinski, that's sort of beyond the focus of my research. I will say, of course, I think we should have a secure southern border, and also, and as I've said, we are one of our greatest advantages is our open, welcoming, being an attractive destination for talent. So we need to ensure that we continue to be that kind of place that bolsters freedom-loving people around the world.
You know, it's interesting when I hear people come up here and they testify before this committee and they say, I ask about, should we complete a wall? And you guys say, oh, that's outside of my scope. You guys, I know you guys are very smart or you wouldn't be here. I read your bios. You're both very smart. You guys both have a lot of common sense. Do you guys have walls around your house? Do you guys have walls in your backyard? Do you know why there are walls at prisons? Do you know why most schools have walls? Do you know why most castles have walls? I'm asking a question. It's a pretty simplistic question, and the American people are tired of it.
I think our openness is a competitive advantage. I mean, not the openness of our border, like literally, but our like open, welcoming environment, the openness of our society.
Well, Ms. Brandt, I would love to see you tell that to some of the people in my district who have lost their loved ones to fentanyl. Do you
Don't
think
mean
that's
the
do you think that's
literal-
do you think that's an advantage to have
No,
parents that
of
are losing their
course not.
kids to fentanyl?
Of course not.
Because that's a byproduct of what you're talking about, ma'am.
Of course not. I'm not speaking about the literal openness of the border, but
That's what you said, openness.
I'm clarifying that I mean the openness of our society.
Thank you.
in a
I yield back.
broader sense.
Gentlemen's time's expired. I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony, the ranking member and members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we would ask the witnesses to respond to those in writing. Pursuant to Committee Rule 7D, the hearing record will be open for 10 days. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.